Hey, everybody, welcome to today's IBM Storage Community webinar. My name is Randy Arsenault. I'm part of the Storage Fusion PM team. We have a really interesting topic today. We've had a lot of discussions lately about application modernization, infrastructure modernization, and what our clients are doing to bring their workloads into kind of the new generation, taking advantage of OpenShift and other container technologies. And there's this concept of a 12-factor application, or a 12-factor modernization of applications. So we reached out to one of our in-house domain experts, Jay Cuthrell. Jay's a partner in our consulting division. And Jay has a lot of experience in this space and agreed to come on and share some content with us. So I'm going to hand it over to Jay. I would say if you have any questions as we go, please enter them into the Q&A panel. We'll address them as we go or after the fact if we don't have time. And I'll come back at the end and give you a few closing comments. But otherwise, Jay, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
All right, Randy, thank you so much for the warm introduction. Glad to be here. And thanks everybody out there in the digital audience for making the time investment to come today. And I don't know if you had your breakfast yet or not, but if someone could confirm that the slides are showing, that would be great. I'll look for that in the background. But what I'd like to talk to you today about is a dozen factors and the past dozen years. So if you weren't aware, there are these 12-factor concepts. If that's not familiar to you, don't worry. We'll get into that in just one moment. But I do want to set context for the discussion today. So again, I'm a partner with IBM Consulting. I've looked at this through a couple of different lenses, and so I'm hoping that today, I know it's not going to be interactive. Formats are what they are, but please do. I would encourage you, if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A panel. We'll get to those and we'll knock them out towards the end. So looking back, the year is 2010. Pew Research Center produces the penultimate story. And the story, if you pulled out what's the lead, it's that all this new mobile technology you've heard about, maybe you've got one of these smart devices, smartphones. People today just call them phones. Like you actually have to go out of your way to say what's not a smartphone. You have to say a feature phone, for example. But if you remember back in those days, thinking back 12 years, the smartphone was enabling this entire application economy. So these were the days of the first smartphones. These were the days of taking what was, if you remember, the web first strategy that became the mobile first strategy, that became maybe the app first strategy. These are the stories that were being trafficked 12 years ago. So this is the anchor point. And throughout the presentation, we will put the source link. So please, don't take our word for it. Please click the links and we'll provide that for you after this event. Or if you're curious, you can reach out to any of us through the contact mechanisms we're going to share today. But these are the original sources. And after the Pew Research Center made this story available, this rise of application culture, a couple of things happened in the market. Well, the first thing that happened in the market is one of the very early platform companies, platform as a service companies, was Heroku. And Heroku had, at this point, become very popular in developer communities. And 90 days after this Pew Research study was produced and published, Salesforce.com bought Heroku for a fairly hefty sum. Even if you think about it, the dollars involved back in 2010, this is a pretty big purchase. And in doing so, the developer community, as with any community where you kind of get you fall in love with a platform, what happens next? Where is this going? And so what's important to understand is that even as this was being acquired, this beloved part of a developer experience being acquired, it didn't stop publishing. And so Adam Wiggins, who's now part of Muse, which is a phenomenal collaborative kind of a digital canvas company, Adam and some others within Heroku published, I don't want to say kind of it's not a manifesto as much as it was the story of what are the essential things for you to succeed in developing and deploying applications and thinking about it in terms of scale. As we're entering this app universe, how are you going to approach that? And so these 12 factors were outlined. And the 12 factors, when they were produced, it caught the attention of developer communities. And I would argue that there has been rising interest in the use of 12-factor app as a methodology. So I would like to separate, again, this was not so much, again, manifesto as much as it is methodology. And like most methodologies, you have the first methodology that's shared, and then you have a community of people that will embrace that. You'll have people that will criticize it. You'll have all of those dialogues. But what will happen is eventually, as it is being embraced over time, as technology changes or shifts, you will probably see someone that will either build upon this orthogonally, or they will explore a white space or an adjacency to it. And maybe you go from 12 factors to 13 factors to 14 factors, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was the first publication of this 12-factor app. And you can go back to archive.org and see it. But even if you go to 12factor.net today, you can see all 12. In addition, there's also an EPUB. So if you're familiar with these kind of digital book formats, you can actually download the EPUB and read it in your favorite online book reader. So I think it's like 18 pages, but it's well worth it to go to 12factor.net, kind of like a history capsule. Check it out, download the EPUB. Now, if you go to something like, say, the Y Combinator site, Hacker News, which some people love, some people don't love, but it's interesting from a data point because the interest in the number of times that 12factor.net, that entire website was shared or talked about or discussed, you see the huge pump that occurs when it was first released. But it's not like it went away either. You actually see this kind of slow simmer. And when Muse and other people associated with Heroku were in the news, coincidentally, it has nothing to do with this presentation, but there was actually another resurgence and two different pops for the reference to 12factor.net. So maybe that's developer nostalgia, whatever the case. If you look at the trending over time, what you'll notice is it's actually been pretty steady. It wasn't something that went away. That slow and simmering boil, if you will, has really captured the hearts, minds, and imaginations of not just developers, but I would argue product managers, people that think and are part of the community and market that either creates developer experience-oriented tools that relate to platform engineering, or they are kind of the basis for you must have the following things as a part of your developer experience. If you're going to produce a better developer experience, provide a platform for developers to get things done, there is that notion of here's what we're doing in development, here's what we're doing in testing, here's what we're doing in quality assurance, here's what we're doing in production, and maintaining as much consistency there as possible. And again, going back to these 12 factors, making sure all 12 of those factors are taken into account. And I would argue that over time, again, that might get extended. So even as we went from, say, web first to potentially mobile first to app first, we now see people talking more in terms of API first. They're thinking in terms of deployments, not just to a cloud. They may be doing things in an IoT sense at the very edge, or they may be doing something in a core data center or a traditional IT environment. You've probably heard that called edge to core to cloud. And so if we fast forward to where we are today, it's probably not shocking that 12 years later, these 12 factors have evolved over time as well. And so arguably, we are probably in a 15-factor world, and you could go research other sources and probably pick up some other ones. But I think the three major elements between the 12-factor and the 15-factor are as follows. And I'm going to try to do a share real quick of something on screen. So hopefully this worked properly. And I'll talk to that in just 1 second. And I've summarized as follows. So this is hopefully going to show you a picture of my browser. And so if we were to compare the 12 factors to the 15 factor as a methodology, really the three things that have been added to the list are around APIs. So thinking in terms of an API first strategy, how are we contemplating many services and many applications potentially interacting in either a cloud or a world of many clouds or a world of hybrid multi-cloud? The second thing that you would see added would be the notion of telemetry. So whereas logging or logs are part of the original 12 factor, telemetry really anticipates that these apps aren't just going to live, say, within a development environment. They are going to make their way into the world. And so if you're familiar with product engineering focus, the notion of I'm going to understand how my user my constituent end user is going to use my application, it's incredibly important for you to have all of this information coming back around key performance indices or other areas that relate to the perception of the efficacy of what you've delivered as functionality within that application, because you adopted these prior other factors. And so that telemetry, that additional factor, is an acknowledgement that the end user, that information, that it's not monitoring, it's not just logging, it's about how is the user interacting and how can we use that to do a better job of engineering our product. And this forms the basis of a lot of what we would call product-led growth. And so these are the kinds of curves that these product owners, product development teams, chief product officers, they covet that information. So that telemetry is really essential. And so there's some great companies that focus exclusively in just making sure that, say, application telemetry is top-notch. And then the last of this list, all you have to do is open any recent news clipping around what's happening with the applications that have been deployed into either the clouds or being used in core data centers, or things that are happening at the edge with IoT. And security will probably come up as a topic. And if it's in the news, I think it's a saying that if it bleeds, it leads. And so some of the things that you see in the news speak to why we need this 15th additional factor. And it's really around thinking through how we authenticate, how we think of what it means to authorize, what is the notion of identity. And there are folks that don't confuse the people with maybe the persona with maybe what could be potentially an agent. And as we go into this more AI infused world, discrete applied machine learning, autonomy in the sense of a system or a system account doing something as if it was a human or another person or a user potentially on your behalf or part of a larger system, it will be more important, not less, when we talk about this 15th factor of security. So I'm going to try now stopping the share that I'm doing. We'll go back to the slides exclusively. And at this point, I'm going to talk about what's next. And I'm going to invite Randy to come back and help me read this slide back to you.
Thanks, Jay. Really interesting discussion. So I did have a couple of observations I wanted to just kind of make based on the things you said, and a couple, kind of rhetorical questions that can maybe stimulate a little conversation. So the first thing you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was this kind of evolution of 12-factor as kind of an intellectual exercise and kind of an academic manifesto into a very widely adopted methodology. And of course, that process, right, the process by which it sort of grows up, in a sense, from being one to the other, involves lots of starts and fits and steps and challenges and lots of different tribal elements. So, you've kind of been in this industry and kind of living through that. Talk a little bit about how the growth from this academic manifesto to a more widely adopted, kind of enterprise grade methodology. What were some of the key events in that maturity, I guess?
Yeah, I would go back to, there was an iconic presentation done by Simon Wardley at an OSCON event. And so this is all things related to open source that you would do from a convention point of view. And he's done the presentation before many times. But the title of the presentation is Situation Normal, Everything Must Change. And in that, he goes into, obviously, there's Simon, Wardley, known for Wardley mapping, which is how you would use mapping as a strategic advantage to you in business, thinking through how you're trying to accomplish things. But he has a great slide around enterprise IT. And roughly stated, you could think of it like the progressions or phases of enterprise IT adoption. And it goes something like this. Initially, it is no, and then it is no, and then it moves on to the next phase, which is no. And then you see this other curve, which is industry-wide adoption outside of enterprise IT, meaning the consumer-to-business world, potentially. Yeah. And now in the business-to-business enterprise IT world, you go from no, 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 no. I think there's another no. And then finally, oh my gosh, oh fudge, we've got to get this starting right now.
We missed it. We missed the boat.
We missed it. Yeah, exactly. We missed the boat. And so I think of this as, again, the 12 factors as a methodology have influenced not just development, but arguably the enterprise independent software vendor ecosystem. So the ISVs that used to be either get my software on a CD-ROM or get my, gosh forbid, on a DVD, download it via the U.S. Postal Service or FedEx. It's now we're going to make you download this or encourage you to download this. And then there's going to be patches. There'll be additional benefits. So I actually see it's kind of slowly leaking into enterprise. I wouldn't say that there was a tip over event, but even in the news, going back to that, the reason why we have that 15th authentication and authorization, I think that the notion of being able to turn around quickly and respond to zero-day threats has increased the vibrancy of updates and patches. I also believe that the requirement for wider participation, meaning potentially team members contributing, if it's a software development organization, contributing globally, not necessarily just within a building. I'm not saying it's a region. I'm just saying it could be someone that's on the other side of a continent. It could be someone on another continent. And so a lot of these patterns opened up what was previously a very siloed enterprise IT. And I think that the drive and as new people come into organizations as change agents, they may take plays from other playbooks that were very applicable in fast-moving, smaller, nimble, quote-unquote, startups that have been brought in as expectations from either senior-level management or boards of directors wondering, why can't we do these things? And I think the cautionary tale, and you have to have a governor for a lot of these discussions, there's always unbridled enthusiasm, but I think it's important to remember that even companies that are as aggressively cloud-first as Netflix was still on Oracle for many, many years as an enterprise IT platform, and then eventually was able to exfiltrate or transmogrify, whatever you want to describe it as, but take apart pieces and parts of that functionality and make them entirely cloud native in nature. So that's how I would say it. It wasn't one thing as much as it was a contributing kind of like a confluence of forces.
Yeah, and as is often the case, the early adopters kind of drive the narrative and demonstrate the value and sort of show what they're able to achieve, and then they kind of share that wealth of knowledge with the rest of the world. And eventually, even the most conservative enterprises, kind of once they see that it's real and that the security concerns are generally manageable, then they'll quickly adopt it. And obviously we're, more tactically speaking, seeing exactly the same trend line or exactly the same operationalization of something like Red Hat OpenShift. So, we as a storage brand with our Fusion portfolio are going right after this space where we're, plugging directly into that, CI/CD pipeline and the interrelationships and interoperability between dev and platform engineering and site reliability engineering and the like, and providing tooling and capabilities and platform infrastructure to help make them more efficient and to help make their communication easier. And one of the things we talked about setting up for this discussion was this whole idea of kind of developer ergonomics, like where do I want to get my stuff from? Where do I want my assets to be kept? Or, what's the technology by which I consume them and assemble them into meaningful workloads? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the first things to acknowledge is open source has really led the way because you think about the number of inputs you can get from that. Again, it's not necessarily in one building or not necessarily in one. It's from anywhere in the world the contribution can come. So I think of, and I'm probably going to butcher the name because I don't necessarily hear people say it, but Che, one of these notions of like, what if I could bring with me a developer environment kind of in a box? And inside of that box, here's everything I would need for my development experience. Then you see this progression, even some of the tracking done by analysts that are quantitative and qualitative. So on the quantitative side, IDC, I believe, is referring to things in certain ways. Maybe they call them a cloud development environment or a cloud integrated development environment. Gartner might tell you about an internal developer platform, an IDP. And so these things have been combined over time. You look at some interesting companies, Honeycomb, others that are taking kind of a much like this 12-factor approach, right? You start off as it sounds like a manifesto, but no, actually it's a methodology. And so as you pull together these opinions that are battle tested with at least maybe 2 or 3 customers, becoming 10 customers, becoming 30 customers, I call these all ibbles and ables. There's everything that's possible. Then there's what becomes permissible. Then there's what becomes sustainable. Then there's something that's repeatable. And at that point, boy, that's advisable. And so if you can get through those ibles and ables, you've gone from, manifesto to methodology to more or less like how you would apply this in a matrix organization. And that makes things very, again, it's advisable for these organizations to embrace that and take that in. But that developer experience today would be determining, and I've heard people describe these as golden paths. What is the golden path to get from point A of no software to the end point, meaning, hey, software has occurred. But more software for the sake of software isn't necessarily good.
Right.
What is good is when we're, again, combining what the business requires, meaning the end users, what those requests are, having a vision for the future, making things better, arguably, than they were the day before. And all that operational proficiency being built in, you nailed it. It's not just the internal development team. It's also, when this goes out into the real world, how is a site reliability engineer going to make sure that the telemetry is telling them, here's where we can make our next contribution to making this even more resilient, and then let the product engineer or the product owner know this is how you make it more adorable. And so those two different pieces and perspectives really speak to the maturity of where we are. Obviously, there's more to come. I don't know if that means that like we'll be back 10 years from now talking, or 12 years talking about 24-factor or 36-factor apps. But I do believe these will be baked into the DNA, if you will, of what are future development environments.
Yeah. And I think a lot more of this will also benefit from higher and deeper degrees of automation. I mean, you look at something like Ansible, or a lot of the automation that's wrapped around OpenShift, for example, and a lot of the steps within that process or that pipeline are increasingly automated. Now we're leveraging AI to make them not only automated but self-aware to some degree. So yeah, it's really a fascinating kind of time to be alive as it relates to a lot of these things.
Yeah,
for sure.
Because you're going from, not to put it, too fine a point, you're going from like the data to the information to that wisdom. You're kind of working your way up that pyramid. And then you've got all these various code whispering this and co-pilots that, or other either nautical or aeronautical kind of analogies that we're trying to make. Right. And I remember Buck Rogers, right? You had the little Twiggy robot, and you had Dr. Theopolis, I think, or maybe I'm getting my sci-fi confused. But you basically had this big clock device on front of the little robot, and that's why Buck Rogers was successful on NBC back in the 80s, or 70s.
Right. All right. Well, so I guess let's kind of wrap it up. So on the last slide here, there's just a smattering of kind of interesting things. In particular, an event. KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, which is coming up here in a couple weeks in Chicago. If anybody's going to be there, please stop by. We'll have a very large presence, big booth. OpenShift Commons is also, I believe, Monday, which is the day before this kicks off. It's kind of a wraparound event. We'll be there as well. We've got a bunch of sessions. So, if you're not already registered, good time to do it. If you are registered, definitely stop by and say hi, get some swag, check out what we have to offer. Speaking of Gartner, there was recently a new, and this is not a commonplace event. It's not very often that Gartner spins up a new Magic Quadrant category, but they did that this year with something called distributed hybrid infrastructure. And Fusion was identified as a visionary, which is cool, given that it's the first time we participated in that new Magic Quadrant. And finally, on the bottom, there's a couple of links here, some additional information from Red Hat, specifically focused on, 12-factor applications in Kubernetes, which is interesting. So some great documentation. There's a GitHub here that has some Fusion stuff if you want to go poke around and kind of see how we do things like enterprise backup and restore and disaster recovery. But, lots of other resources available. We will make sure to provide this material to anybody who participated, as well as in the recording. I'm not sure, Jay, if your screen was full size when you showed your list of 12 and 15 factor stuff. So I think what we may want to do is add that as a supplement or something, and just make sure people have that as a reference as well. So, but I think that's it. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Jay, thank you so much for participating. This was a great discussion.
Thank you, Randy.
Plan to have more in the future. Thank you everybody for attending, and I will turn it back over to Michael to take us out. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Randy and Jay. I just want to thank everyone in the audience for taking the time to join us today. You will be emailed links to the on-demand recording, as well as links to the slide deck later on today. Thanks for watching around the globe, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.